end of my second week here in Uganda. I'm halfway through my assignment and things are going extremely well. I've been doing a lot of good work with many of my colleagues here in Uganda, and I know that I haven't been telling you what is it that actually have been doing in my assignment here, and I haven't told you very well in detail what is it that Uganda is doing. The reason why I am delaying to present that to you is because I wanted to have a better understanding of the business and about what is it that I was doing before actually talking about that. So what I'm going to be doing in the next couple of weeks is to post in the blog and in some videos a bit more of detail of those things. I'm going to be explaining what is the business model and the social impact that Uganda is having, and also going into how a mathematician that is working in a financial institution in London can help in any way or form to a company like Uganda. But that is going to be in the next couple of weeks. What I wanted to do today was to wrap up some of the things that I have already started talking in my previous videos. I have already presented this framework, this definition about microfinance being financial services for the poor. In my previous video, I did perhaps an unusual plea for highlighting the importance of financial services for everybody. And I think that now the next step is to highlight why is it important that financial services are available not only for the middle class or for the economical elites, but also for the poorest. So with that, I would like to set up for today a discussion about poverty. I think that there are different ways of tackling the problem of poverty, the concept of poverty. And what I'm going to do today is to approach it mostly from the way in which I have found it in different books and conversations with colleagues here. And I think that at this point I'm having a rough framework for understanding what poverty is. If you see what is the technical definition of poverty, you will see that is someone who has an income of $2 or less per day. And of course, you take into account variations of where the person is. So you do a normalization. So you can compare someone who is living in Bangladesh or someone who's living in South Africa or in Colombia or here in Uganda. So you take that into account, and at some point you can have a comparable income. From that point, the conversation starts about poverty, and usually about which are going to be some of the ways of alleviating poverty. Now, I think that that is a good starting point for the discussion of poverty. However, I think that poverty is a much more complex phenomenon, and I can identify that it has three elements that makes it so difficult to grasp and to understand and to follow, and of course to reduce it. I think that poverty is a multidimensional, multi-scale, variable in time phenomenon. I think that is multidimensional in the sense that it is driven by different factors, not only one. I think it's a conceptual error to try to simplify such a complex problem as poverty to just one variable. There are explanations in terms of geography, in terms of strength of the institutions available in a country, in terms of natural resources, in terms of corruption, in terms of civil war or war with neighboring countries. The second element of this complex problem that I'm talking about, which is poverty, is the multi-scale element that it has. You can go to the most macro level and talk about poor countries and rich countries and try to understand which are the dynamics that drive one or the other. You can zoom in and talk about inside countries, about regions. So I can think of, in Colombia, for example, the regions in the center of the country being much more rich than some of the regions in the Pacific coast, for example. That is something that you can also apply for developed countries. If you are seeing England, you're going to see that there are regions that are much more developed and are more rich than some others. So you can also apply poverty at that level. But you can go a step further, of course, and talk about individuals being poor. And that is something that I'm going to be talking at the end of this video. I think that is probably the most interesting aspect. The last element in describing poverty is the variability across time. You have to acknowledge that there are some dynamics that are moving up and down the drivers of poverty. Now, let me move on to something that I wanted to do for a while, and that is to mention some of the books that I have come across in the last few months. And what I did was to uh, buy them all in Kindle, and I brought them here to Uganda, and I have been reading some of them for the first time, and I'm rereading some of them that I have read in the past. So there are two categories. On one hand, you have those books that are trying to explain poverty in a top-down way. So these are the authors that are posing the big questions. Why is it that some countries are poor and some countries are rich? Why is it that some countries manage to get power and some others can't? So let me start with Jeffrey Sachs' A World Without Poverty, in which there is this explanation about geography as being the key driver, but also highlighting the importance of aid to be able to tackle poverty. On the other side of the spectrum, you're going to find William Easterly's White Man's Burden, or Dambisa Moyo with her Debt Aid. So these are authors that are giving a different prescription of the problem of poverty. And in particular, Moyo claims that it is actually aid the main driver for poverty, in Africa at least. In between these two ends, you have someone like Paul Collier with his book The Bottom Billion, in which he proposes a set of traps that drag a country into poverty. And you have there the concepts of conflicts as being a trap, or natural resources, or bad governance. Another book is by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson on Why Nations Fail. And there is a very prolonged discussion of how the weakness of institutions is the one defining characteristic for a country to be successful or to be poor. And an old one, Jared Diamond's Gun, Germs and Steel, in which he talks about environmental differences as the main driver. Now, a different category of books are the ones that I think are going on the opposite direction. Instead of going top-down, they are trying to understand poverty from a bottom-up approach. And there are two very good books on this. One is by Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, Poor Economics. This is a very good book in which what the authors are proposing is to understand how the poor people are making decisions and trying to understand whether aid in a certain way can help them. The way in which they measure this is by running randomized controlled trials, and depending on what is the outcome of these scientific trials, they can decide whether a particular approach is better than the other. I'm not going to talk now about randomized controlled trials. I'm going to probably talk about that next week. But I think that the approach that they have of fleshing out how poor people are actually managing their money and how they are thinking of problems, it is fascinating. I think that it's tremendously revealing to go into the houses of the poor people and trying to understand what is the sort of rationality that they're having. And the first conclusion that you will get from this book is that it's extremely complex. So from all the books that I have talked so far, this is the one that I can recommend very, very highly. Now, the last book that I would like to mention is probably my favorite one, by Darrell Collins. It's called Portfolios of the Poor. And for me, this is a fantastic read, a very short book in which the author collects the financial stories of some 250 different families in India, South Africa, and Bangladesh. Perhaps because I am so keen on finance, I found Portfolios of the Poor an fascinating reading. What it shows you in this book is how complex and how sophisticated is the different accounting elements of a poor person. The author goes into the trouble of showing you how the balance sheet of a poor person would look like, and even more interesting, how the cash flow of a poor family looks like. The findings are tremendously revealing. What he shows is that the economical activity of a poor person is extraordinarily high. Just because a poor family doesn't have that much income, that doesn't mean that they are passive in terms of the type of financial activity that they must have. It really opened my eyes. And I read this book before I came here to Uganda. I'm reading it again. It is by all means a very important reading, especially if you are thinking about microfinance. There are three observations that Colin made about poverty, which are shaping completely my view of how microfinance should work. First of all, a low income. And I think that that is pretty reasonable, and that is something that it is intuitive. The second element is the nature of volatility. I began this video talking about the $2 per person as the definition of a poor person. However, what makes the matter worse is that these $2 are not something that a poor person is going to be receiving every single day. Now, when you think about it, that makes complete sense. You would not be expecting that a poor person is receiving every single day $2, but there is a tremendous amount of unpredictability of when these cash flows are going to be coming in. It might be that today you're going to receive $10, but it's going to be perhaps 20 days until you receive the next payment or until you receive the next cash injection. This incapability of predicting how much money you're going to have is probably as decisive as the low income element of describing a poor person. This is something that the author spends a lot of time, but something in which I'm going to think much more about. Because how can you manage these very volatile cash flows and smoothing them out in some way? I think that is a tremendous challenge when you are talking about poverty at that very granular level, at the level of the individual. The third component of poverty that Colin talks in his book is the lack of financial services that are suitable for solving the problems of the poor. And this is where I'm connecting what I've talked in my previous video, in which I was talking about financial services. I ended my video asking why a poor person should care about financial services. The reality is that one of the main problems of a poor person is he or she doesn't have the resources to access financial services that can help them to smooth their payments, or perhaps to save, or perhaps to invest. So the lack of financial services, it is extremely important and defines the characteristics of the poor. To summarize, poverty at the individual level, according to Colin, can be described by three elements: low incomes, tremendously high volatility and unpredictability of when the money is actually going to come, and lack of financial services that can help them to smooth out all the difficult conditions that they have. Whenever you are thinking about microfinance, what you're trying to attack is the problem of how to construct very carefully a product that is flexible enough, that is helpful enough, and that at the end of the day help the people to alleviate this condition. So when I'm talking about microfinance, I'm not talking only about microcredit, which is usually the image that we use to describe microfinance, but I'm also talking about micro savings and micro insurance and micro leasing as well, and clever ways for people to pay that help them to move their money in a better way. There are much more to say about the book Portfolios of the Poor, and I highly recommend that if you're interested in microfinance, or if you're going to be reading only one book, read that one, because it really brings to the surface the core elements that we should be thinking when we are thinking about microfinance. So I think that I'm going to stop with that today. What I'm going to be doing next is to connect what I've just talked about with my experience here in Uganda, and particularly what Tugande is doing, which I believe is a fantastic example of a creative solution for tackling the financial problems of the poor. Something that you might be already perceiving is that I have a preference for the bottom-up approach, for starting from the granular level and from there it starts constructing. I am not such a big enthusiast of these top-down approaches in which you are deciding in a very wise way which are the drivers of poverty in different countries and regions. I have no idea about that, and to be honest, I am a bit skeptical about it, but I'm gonna be talking about that perhaps in a different video. It's Friday here. I am probably gonna go and grab a beer with some of the guys here from the office, and over the weekend I expect to do a trip that I hope I can comment more, or at least take some interesting adventurous pictures. I'll see you guys later. Bye bye.